can't park that harvester here. This community has standards, and you're getting a $5,000 fine.
This is my driveway, my livelihood, and I'm not backing down.
The morning Karen decided to fine me $5,000 for parking my harvester on my own driveway began like any other quiet country sunrise. Golden lights spilling across my fields and the comforting hum of birds drifting over the fence line. But by noon, the peace I had worked decades to build was splintering beneath the weight of a single ridiculous notice shoved under my windshield wiper. For 20 years, I had lived in this lakeside farming community, a place where neighbors once waved from porches and helped push stuck tractors out of the mud, and never imagined a day would come when the simple act of bringing my grain harvester home after a long season's work would be treated like a crime. To me, that machine wasn't just metal and gears. It was the proof of a lifetime's labor, a symbol of every dawn I had risen before the rooster, every blistered hand and missed family dinner spent coaxing crops from stubborn soil. It had cut through storms and droughts, kept my small farm afloat, and finally let me afford this modest property near the water, where I thought retirement might be peaceful. But Karen, president of the Homeowners Association, saw something else entirely. To her, my harvester was an eyesore, an affront to the glossy brochure image she wanted our neighborhood to uphold. A neighborhood she ruled with a clipboard clutched like a scepter and a lipstick shade as loud as her voice. Her sprawling, manicured lawn and gleaming SUV already screamed for attention, but apparently, even the slightest deviation from her self-imposed standards was a threat to her little kingdom. In her world, lawn gnomes were contraband, mailboxes had to be painted only 2 shades of beige, and porch lights could be no more than 40 watts. She thrived on fear. Quiet neighbors tiptoed around her, trimming hedges twice to avoid another warning letter. I had ignored her posturing for years, paying my modest HOA dues and keeping my place tidy, believing that as long as I wasn't causing trouble, trouble wouldn't come for me. That illusion shattered the instant I unfolded the violation notice and read the words. Immediate fine, $5,000. Unauthorized agricultural equipment on residential property, $5,000. For parking a machine on my own concrete slab for a single night. My heart pounded, disbelief quickly morphing into a slow-burning anger. I had built this life plank by plank, dollar by dollar, and now one arrogant neighbor was threatening to strip me of hard-earned peace. The harvester had barely cooled from the long drive home when Karen's manicured hand had delivered that paper, and I could almost hear her smug satisfaction echoing over the lake as I crumpled it in my fist. It wasn't just the absurdity of the fine. It was the hypocrisy. I had seen her own driveway crowded with catered party vans that blocked traffic, her unregistered boat stored across common property for weeks, and her extravagant pergola extension that had never appeared in any HOA minutes. Yet here she was, using the rules like a hammer to crush me for something far less intrusive. My first instinct was to storm up her walkway and demand an explanation, but years of working the land had taught me patience. Storms pass, but roots endure. Instead, I unfolded my own HOA bylaws binder, the thick packet everyone receives but few ever read, and began searching for the exact rule she claimed I'd broken. Buried among the dry legal text was a clause about commercial vehicles or equipment, ambiguous enough for her to twist, but far from ironclad. It didn't specify farm equipment, didn't define duration, and certainly didn't justify a fine so outrageous as the sun sank behind the trees. I sat on my porch nursing a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the harvester that had carried me through decades of harvests. Its metal frame gleamed in the twilight, and I felt the weight of what it represented. Karen's paper fine wasn't just about money. It was an attempt to intimidate, to remind everyone who held the crown. But as I listened to frogs croak along the shoreline and watched a heron glide silently over the water, a different thought settled in. Bullies like Karen only win when people let them. Somewhere beneath the irritation, a quiet resolve began to form. She thought I'd quietly write a check, tuck my tail, and move on. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Over the next few days, the tension thickened like summer humidity. Karen's SUV lingered near my property more than usual, her sunglasses flashing as she inspected every inch of my yard. Neighbors whispered at the mailbox, casting sympathetic but nervous glances my way, clearly unwilling to cross her. Each morning, I found new HOA envelopes stacked in my mailbox, warnings about grass length irregularities and driveway oil stains that didn't even exist. It was obvious she was escalating, testing my patience and hoping to break my will. But while she was counting violations, I was counting her missteps. I remembered her loud brag at the last HOA picnic about skipping the new boat registration process because rules are just red tape for people without charm. I remembered Bob mentioning, offhand, that her patio renovation had never been approved. Karen had built her throne on rotting planks, and I was beginning to see every crack. That first week after the fine, I made a decision. I would not react in anger, and I would not let her narrative control the neighborhood. Instead, I would quietly gather facts, allies, and leverage. I spent evenings reviewing HOA meeting minutes, combing through bylaws, and snapping photos of every questionable thing Karen had ever done. Her boat edging into restricted wetlands, her trash cans left out past the allowed time, her security lights glaring past midnight. With every detail I collected, my anger cooled into something sharper: strategy. Because if Karen wanted a war over a harvester, then she was about to find out just how deep a farmer's roots can go when threatened. The following week unfolded like the slow tightening of a vice. The kind where you do not feel the pressure all at once, but sense it inching closer with every breath. And Karen's presence became a shadow across my driveway, a constant reminder that this battle had only just begun. She strutted past my mailbox twice a day, pretending to inspect flower beds or retrieve non-existent letters, her sunglasses reflecting the harvester she despised as though it were a stain on her perfect reflection. Neighbors who once greeted me warmly now shifted their eyes, not out of dislike for me, but out of fear of her wrath. And I could almost hear the whispers fluttering from porch to porch as the story of the outrageous fine spread like wildfire. Yet beneath their fear, I sensed a quiet frustration simmering in the community. Memories of her past overreaches, surfacing like stones in a low tide. The time she forced the Martins to repaint their shutters twice in one summer for being too cheerful. The weekend she demanded Bob replace his bird feeder because its design was non-conforming. The countless small humiliations she had inflicted under the banner of property values. These memories became the embers I would one day stoke. I devoted my evenings to building an unassailable case, spreading HOA minutes across my kitchen table until the wood grain vanished under piles of paper, highlighting contradictions, copying bylaws, and marking every point where Karen herself had bent or broken the very rules she wielded as weapons. Her boat registration, which she had once laughed about skipping, was nowhere to be found in the county database. Her pergola extension had never been approved by a board vote. Her party vans had blocked emergency access roads more times than I could count. Every page I added to the binder was another plank pulled from beneath her throne, and I felt my anger transform into a cold, methodical determination. I also began reaching out quietly to neighbors, starting with Bob over a casual conversation at the bait shop, easing the topic toward Karen's hypocrisy without directly inviting confrontation. One by one, small confessions emerged: fines for wind chimes, warnings for flower boxes, threats over yard art. The Martins admitted they had been too intimidated to push back when she threatened to report their grandkids for noise violations after a summer barbecue. A young couple whispered about her barging into their backyard uninvited to measure their fence posts. It became clear that beneath her polished exterior and faux concern for aesthetics, Karen had built a reign of fear, and that fear was cracking now that someone had dared to resist. Meanwhile, I maintained a facade of calm. I kept my lawn trimmed to perfection, my driveway swept, and the harvester discreetly moved to my barn so she could not accuse me of further violations. But the damage was already done. She had overplayed her hand, and people were watching. At the next HOA meeting, she attempted to grandstand, using my alleged defiance as an example of chaos threatening our peaceful community, but the room's energy had shifted. The loyalists still nodded on cue, yet I caught more than a few skeptical glances darting between neighbors, silent questions forming behind pursed lips. I stayed quiet then, letting her dig deeper into her own arrogance while my binder of evidence rested like a loaded weapon in my truck outside. The timing had to be perfect. The blow had to be public and undeniable. That night, under the soft glow of my porch light. I reviewed my strategy again and again, rehearsing the order of evidence, imagining the precise moment I would reveal her boat's registration lapse, the HOA property misuse, and the stack of ignored rules. The air felt electric with anticipation, and even the frogs along the shoreline seemed to croak in agreement that her reign was nearing its end. By the end of that week, word had spread quietly among the braver neighbors that something big was brewing, a reckoning they had long hoped for but never dared to initiate. And while Karen prowled the neighborhood like a hawk circling its prey, she failed to realize that the ground beneath her was already giving way, and that the man she believed to be a simple farmer was laying the foundation for the storm that would sweep her crown away. The morning of the next HOA meeting arrived with a kind of quiet intensity that reminded me of the stillness before a thunderstorm. The lake's surface unnaturally smooth and the air heavy, as if even nature sensed the tipping point approaching. I spent those early hours methodically reviewing every page in my binder, double-checking dates, measurements, and county records until the evidence was as airtight as a freshly sealed grain silo. My heart pounded with a steady rhythm, not from fear but from anticipation, because I knew the stage had been set and Karen was walking blindly into her own undoing. Throughout the day, I went about my chores as usual, harvesting late-season vegetables, tightening loose boards on my fence, and maintaining the outward calm of a man who had nothing to prove. But beneath that calm was a farmer's patience honed over decades, patience that knew when to wait for a crop to ripen before bringing in the harvest. As the sun dipped low and streaked the sky in amber and rose, I drove to the community hall early, taking a seat near the sidewall where I could watch every face as they filed in. One by one, neighbors arrived, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet excitement, whispers threading between the rows of chairs like wind through cornstalks. By the time Karen swept in, her heels clicking against the polished floor like drumbeats of arrogance, the air was charged. She carried her clipboard as if it were a royal decree, her tailored blazer broadcasting authority, and her eyes briefly scanned the room before landing on me with a smirk that betrayed her certainty of victory. I remained still, letting her mistake my silence for submission. When the meeting began, she launched into her familiar performance about protecting property values and maintaining order, layering every sentence with self-importance and using my alleged violation as her prime example of why strict rules were essential. I could feel the room's attention flickering between us, some faces still deferential to her, others betraying the flicker of doubt that had been growing since word of her own infractions began to circulate. My binder rested on my lap, heavy with the weight of truth, and I waited for the perfect moment to release it. When she finally reached the crescendo of her speech, insisting that unchecked behavior would lead to chaos and decay, I rose with measured calm, every movement deliberate like a man lifting a final hay bale onto a wagon. The collective breath of the room seemed to pause as all eyes shifted toward me. I did not need raised voices or sharp words. The power of proof would speak louder than any anger. I carried the binder to the front, opened it with practiced care, and began laying out the pages, photographs of her unregistered boat tied illegally on HOA land, copies of bylaws she herself had ignored, meeting minutes absent of any vote approving her pergola or extended dock, screenshots of the county database confirming her missing registration. Each page landed on the table like another nail in the coffin of her credibility, and the murmurs around the room swelled into an audible wave of shock and recognition. The once timid neighbors leaned forward, their eyes widening as years of suppressed frustration found a voice through the evidence on display. Karen's carefully constructed image wavered like heat haze over asphalt, her cheeks flushing as she tried to maintain her composure, but the weight of her hypocrisy was too heavy to hide. I could sense the collective realization settling over the room. The queen of fines and threats had been playing by her own rules all along. Outside the hall, the tow company I had arranged waited with the proper paperwork authorized under the very bylaws Karen loved to wield, ready to impound the unregistered boat that had been her pride and intimidation tool. Timing mattered, and I had chosen this night deliberately, knowing that the moment her authority cracked, the spectacle of her prized possession being rolled away would seal the shift in power. As the meeting devolved into murmured disbelief and hushed conversations, the sound of a truck engine idling outside drifted through the open windows, a subtle reminder that actions carry consequences. In that instant, the entire balance of our community's power tilted, and Karen, who had strutted into the room certain of her control, began to grasp the depth of the trap she had walked into. The moment the tow truck's doors opened and the men in uniform stepped onto the grass, the hum of conversation inside the hall stilled as though someone had cut the sound from the world. And every eye turned toward the windows where Karen's gleaming boat sat tethered in its usual place of privilege. The tow crew moved with quiet efficiency, their clipboards holding every legal authorization signed, stamped, and sealed, and the reality of what was happening swept across the room like a gust of cold wind. The same neighbors who had once averted their gaze from her wrath now leaned toward the glass, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and long-suppressed satisfaction, because they understood they were witnessing the unraveling of years of intimidation. Karen's carefully polished persona cracked in real time, the weight of her own ignored rules now dragging her pride across the gravel path as the boat trailer creaked into motion. Some neighbors gasped softly, others exchanged glances heavy with unspoken vindication, and for the first time in memory, the community hall was free of her overbearing voice. Outside, the tow rig rolled forward, its taillights glowing against the darkening sky as her symbol of authority disappeared down the road. And the sound of its departure was a quiet thunderclap that marked the end of her reign. By the time the meeting dissolved, the room's mood had shifted from tense disbelief to an almost buoyant relief, shoulders unburdening as if an oppressive weight had been lifted. Over the following days, the neighborhood felt transformed. Laughter returned to porches. Wind chimes tinkled freely without fear of a citation, and neighbors greeted one another without the nervous glances that had once accompanied Karen's looming presence. The Martins brought over a pie and thanked me for standing firm. Bob repaired his bird feeder and left it proudly in view. Children played on lawns a little louder, their joy no longer shadowed by the threat of fines. Karen tried to rally, filing appeals, circulating letters, and even calling for an emergency vote to reinstate her authority. But without her boat, and with her hypocrisy laid bare, her influence evaporated like morning mist on the lake. Within weeks, the board called for a vote of no confidence, and her loyalists, now free of fear, quietly abandoned her. The motion passed without drama, and suddenly she was no longer president, no longer feared, just another neighbor walking past with her head lowered and no clipboard in hand. Word of the confrontation traveled far beyond our small community, carried on whispers at local diners and bait shops, and people spoke of it as though it were a fable about standing up to bullies. For me, life returned to the rhythm I had always cherished. Mornings with coffee on my porch watching the sunrise over fields that had sustained me for decades. Afternoons tending to my crops or mending a fence. And evenings sitting on the dock with the water lapping gently against the boards. The harvester, cleaned and parked where it belonged, stood once again as a quiet monument to perseverance and honest work, no longer a target but a testament. I reinforced part of my dock and polished the harvester's metal frame not because anyone demanded it, but because it reminded me that control belongs not to those who bark the loudest, but to those who know their worth and stand their ground. Every so often, I would see Karen walking the neighborhood path, her shoulders slightly hunched, her once commanding stride reduced to a cautious shuffle, and I felt no gloating satisfaction, only a calm understanding that power built on intimidation can never last. The community, once fractured by fear, had grown stronger through the ordeal, bound now by a shared awareness that rules must apply equally to all, and that silence only feeds tyranny. The lake, bathed in evening light, seemed to shimmer with a new kind of peace, one hard-earned and deeply appreciated. And as I cast a fishing line into the water with the first stars appearing overhead, I knew that the season of fear had ended. Karen's downfall had not been about humiliation for its own sake, but about restoring fairness, dignity, and freedom to a neighborhood that had nearly forgotten what those things felt like. The fine she had issued had been nothing more than paper, but the lesson it brought, one about patience, preparation, and quiet strength, would remain long after the memory of her boat's taillights faded into the horizon.